Okay, so welcome everyone to this presentation. I've called it Astrology Beyond Transits. And so the reason for that is we all talk about transits as astrologers, of course, but it's just because transits are easier to talk about publicly. And when we get into what this topic is all about, which is planetary cycles in Indian astrology or Vedic astrology, that really buries down deeper into the chart and what's being triggered in the chart. So it really is more relevant to the individual. So let's just start with a chant, because it's always good to chant for Ganesh, the Lord of Vedic astrology. And in this very simple form, and I'm going to chant this 3 times. You can chant along with me if you wish. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. So that's a very simple chant you can do yourself as well for Ganesh, the remover of obstacles. So it helps us to be clear in speech and in communication and in hearing what's being presented. That's Ganesh. So Ganapataye Namah. Now, again, if you don't have your own timeline, you don't have to have it right now. So I'm just seeing a message there. If you can't find your timeline right now, that's fine. But you can watch this recording back, and with your timeline, then it'll make more sense. In fact, it might be better not to have your timelines. Just watch the presentation, go get your timelines, and then some point look back and work it out yourself. Okay, but if you don't have them, these are 2 options. So you can either go to this website, astro-seek.com, and go to their sidereal astrology chart calculator. The reason I'm pointing to this one is because I've tried a lot of them, and because I was born at a time of year that's kind of on the cusp of the daylight saving, a lot of chart calculators don't do mine correctly. So I always know when one is really accurate, a good one, when it does mine correctly. And this is one. So this astroseek.com, and again, put in their sidereal astrology chart calculator and you'll get it. Or the other option is to email me at info@timelineastrology.com and I'll be happy to calculate that for you. So this is an overview of what I'll go through today. And I've had to kind of take just a slice of astrology out here and try and bury deeper into it to kind of give any sort of depth to it. But even then, it's still skimming over it a little bit. But I'd rather do that and kind of do that well than try and bury too far deep down. So a few things we'll be looking at. First of all, life stages, natural life stages we all go through. We all experience different stages in our life at different times, naturally, and that's everybody. And then there are the planetary cycles, which I'll be talking about primarily today. And these are called daśās in Indian astrology. And so I'll talk about these. And then I'm going to break those down into levels and also phases within those cycles, phases of experience. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the results based on various factors, and that's very much down to each individual's chart. And so we won't have the scope of that under this seminar, because it's just too much detail. I'll use an example chart, but really a chart reading can only be done by someone who can read a chart. For you and for your own life, and this is why I really feel like timelines are such a great way for anyone to use astrology. It's just easy to follow dates and cycles because they're literally printed out for you, so you can follow it easily, very easily. So then I'll talk about the 9 planets specifically, or what we call the Caesars, or grahas is the Sanskrit word, which means to grab, and talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about the 27 signs, the star signs or nakshatras of Indian astrology, and how each of those then planets, the 9 planets, are repeating 3 times. So 9 planets, 3 by 3 cycles equals 27 stars. So star signs. Then I'll talk a bit more about different patterns that you can see in the cycles, including the golden ratio, which is for me a fascinating topic. And I'll relay that to you later on as well. So to begin then, this is the stages of life. These are the natural stages of life, what are referred to in Indian astrology as Nisargika. So this is the same for every single person. You know, we all have our own different planetary cycles, but everybody goes through these stages. Now, depending on the strength or weakness or weakness of a planet, because planets can be strong and weak in different areas, would show the influence in these particular time periods. But generally, this is how we develop through life. So for the first year of life, everybody has a moon experience. And that basically is a very important part of life, of course, because the moon is our emotional well-being and our attachment to our caregiver. Our primary caregiver, of course, is usually our mother. So that's the moon. So if there's any indications in the chart about, you know, blockages to that, for example, if there are afflictions to the moon in the chart, this would show up in the first year. And we'll talk about the first and the initial cycles that begin in a person's life being very impactful, because even though that cycle has long since passed, the first cycle when you were born is just like your chart when you were born. That has long since passed also, but you keep it with you. And so that first cycle when you were born has a big impact and shows your nature enormously. The reason I put an arrow out here is because this is where these planetary cycles I'll be talking about come from. They're calculated from the position of your moon. So based on the position of your moon, these cycles begin and run in a certain sequence. And the sequence is the same for everybody, but depending on the position of each person's moon, we will start at different phases within that sequence. So that's the first year of life, the moon, very important for attachment. The second phase is from first year to the second year, to the third year. So this is, of course, the terrible twos. This is the Mars period of life. This is when we're, as a child, trying to separate ourselves from our caregiver and find some independence. And so this is the Mars, and whether how well we can do that or not is dependent on Mars, of course. The next phase then is from 3 until 12 years of age, and that's Mercury, where we're learning a lot. We're really expanding then and learning a lot about interacting with other people. That's Mercury. Then from 12 until 32 are the Venus years. And of course, that's the teenage years in our 20s when we really form relationships. You know, our hormones and all of that go into flux in our puberty. That's all Venus related stuff. And relationships and all of that are represented by Venus. So then from 32 until 50 are our Jupiter years. And Jupiter is all about our dharma. It's all about our purpose. And some people's purpose is to make, have a family, to have children, which is a Jupiter thing, to expand families and all of that. Jupiter is all about expansion, but other people's it's work, but whatever your dharma or purpose is on life, Jupiter 30s and 40s are the time where we really get into that. So let me use a highlighter, it might be easier. So then the sun comes from 50 to 75. So these are our golden years. So for everybody, these are our golden years. And depending again on the sun's position in the chart and so on, would show how we experience our golden years. And then after 75 until 108, it says here, but we can say that it's roughly, our last years, if you want to say, is Saturn, because Saturn's all about receding from the world. And so receding from the world doesn't necessarily or always mean, difficulties, of course, because for some people, sadhu type of people who are like Saturn, it's just about being more of a renunciate. So it's just a stage of life. So they're the natural stages of life, and you have to take those into account when you're talking about any planetary cycles we'll refer to more specifically in a person's chart. So it has to be kept in context. So for example, if somebody's in a Venus cycle, and it's all about generally about, relationships and so on, and sexuality and all of that, figuring themselves out in that way. But you look at their planetary cycle and it represents Saturn, and they go through this Saturn period when they're that young. You know, that's going to qualify that Venus enormously. Whereas somebody who's in that Venus period and their own planetary cycle is Venus, then it's definitely a lot more accentuated Venus time for them. So you have to kind of view them both together, is what I'm saying there. So here are the planetary cycles. So this sequence is not given in text. It starts with the moon, or the sun, sorry. And there's reasons for that I won't go into now, but I'm doing it starting from K2, the south node of the moon, for a very specific reason I'll show you later. But this is the sequence anyway, wherever you started, whether you started from the sun or moon or wherever you go, it's in this sequence and it repeats. So K2 is the south node, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu is the north node of the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, and then repeats K2, Venus, and it repeats on many levels. So these are the major levels and how long they last. So the south node of the moon lasts 7 years. Venus is the longest, lasts 20. Sun 6, Moon 10, Mars 7, North Node Rahu 18, Jupiter 16, Saturn 19, Mercury 17, all adding up to 120. And you'll see this often in charts, Vimshottari Dasha, which is basically 120. That's all that means, 120. So that's the ideal lifespan, in other words. And again, later on, I'll show you how this is broken down in terms of subcycles within cycles and cycles within cycles. So it really can really be honed in on down to the minute. But generally, we look at the first 3 levels, which I'll show you now. So yeah, so that's the major cycles. Like I said, they repeat every minute, every hour, every day, every week and month and year. And so they're changing all the time. But when you're in a cycle that's this long, it takes a long time to change, of course. If you're on a major level of Venus for 20 years, that's 20 years long. But every minute of every day, you're going into a Venus cycle. And it's changing from Venus, then to the sun, to moon, to Mars, to Rahu, Jupiter, and so on. So every hour it's changing, every day it's changing, every week, every month, every year. So it's good then to understand why this cycle, why this particular cycle. So we'll get a bit of an insight, hopefully, from this. Why? So overall, you can actually bury down to 8 levels, believe it or not. 6 levels are sometimes used, but more than anything, 3 levels, 3 major levels. So from decades, years, and months, those are the first 3 levels that most people work with. Because let's face it, when you're having a reading, it's usually every few months or every few years. You're not having it every few weeks or a few days or hours, but you could bury down to like minutes, literally, and down to 8 levels. So the first 3 levels are the most impactful as well, because minutes and hours and days are changing obviously rapidly, weeks as well, but then months, years, and decades stay with you for a long time, so they're going to have a bigger impact. So the first level is on the soul level, and it's a level of being and of higher mind, I've written here. It lasts for many years and even decades, shows lessons, overall experiences, and circumstances over a longer period of time. So that's the main level, major level. Then there's a second level, and that's more an emotional level and feelings. So many months up to 3 years. So it can be around 3 years at most. This represents how we're feeling about where we find ourselves, as in where we find ourselves in this first level, in our life experience and circumstances, as well as the people we meet to help us learn these bigger life lessons. So this is very much about who we're meeting and how we're feeling. And so this is actually seen as the most important level. It's how we're feeling about our life is more important than actually what's happening. Then the third level shows how we're reacting to all of that. Our circumstances, the first level, our emotions, the second level, who we're meeting, and how then we're reacting is on the third level, which is why it's a good one to know, because it'll show your reactions and how you're applying your intelligence. And it represents final decisions then that you make based on how you're feeling and everything that's happening. But this shows the decisions you're making. So this is why the first 3 levels are used mostly. So it shows reactions to all the above relates to the planet of innate intelligence, which is Jupiter, as well as the ascendant, because the ascendant very much relates to the intelligence. The ascendant and Jupiter both represent this. So it kind of said here that all of these levels work together and within each other, just like each part of the brain does. So you have like the more kind of primal brain, if you want to think of it that way, the third level, deeply rooted, where we're making our decisions based on that gut instinct, you know, that reactive sense. You can call it, you know, there's all that part of the brain, like the root stem. But then you have the limbic system, and the limbic system represents more the emotional brain, you could say, and then the higher mind, if you want to call it, and the neocortex, right? So that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, of course, because the brain is a very complex thing that's all working together. But at the same time, all these levels are working together. You can't really separate them out either. So when you're on a major level of one planet, another second level of a different planet, and then a third level of another planet, all three combine to make you feel a certain way and decide on something. So this hopefully will make more sense as I go forward. But that's generally the first three levels. So these three main levels of experience then are calculated from the sun, moon, and ascendant. So the sun being the soul or being, the first level shows, again, overall experiences over a longer period of time. And these become embedded in our being. So that's why this is a level of being, because if you're in a Venus cycle for 20 years, that hasn't changed for so many years that this is part of who you are now. And you think that's going to go on forever because it's for so long. So whereas with the sun, it's less, but it's still 6 years. That's the shortest one, the sun. So that's this level of being. And again, you can read it from the sun more so. So the cycle that you're in on that level, the first level, the major level, you can read your chart from the sun and look at the planet from the sun. So that's a bit more advanced, maybe for some people who aren't used to looking at their charts, but that's for those who can read charts. So the next level is on the mind and feeling, and read from the moon more so. So the second level shows how we're feeling about where we find ourselves, as well as the people we meet to help us learn these bigger lessons. So you can literally read it from the moon. So on this second level of the cycle, read that planet from the moon in your chart to see what the influence is there. And then the third level, and that's the level of the body and of doing. And this is the ascendant. So the third level shows how we're reacting to all the above. And this level reflects how we are applying our intelligence based on the above, our current emotional experience and circumstances. So again, this is what's making the decision. I'm just trying to highlight this. This is what's making the decision ultimately. And even just thinking about it as the ascendant and the body and the intelligence, how the body has an intelligence and it reacts before your mind kicks in, before anything else kicks in. So it's the body that's reacting, basically. So there are many things to consider, of course, reading a chart. But the main three things to consider when you're looking at any cycle in a person's life is what is actually promised in the birth chart. What is going on in the birth chart, first of all? Who is the person? And that's a very complex, intricate thing when you're looking at a person's birth chart. But the second thing then is the planetary cycle. Is it active? Because you can have something in your chart from birth, but it might not be active yet. So it has to be active in the cycles. So it has to be in your chart, number one. It then has to be activated in the cycles, but then it needs a third element, which is a transit triggering something to happen. Because this might be promised in the chart, and it might be the cycle you're currently experiencing, and you are experiencing it emotionally or whatever it may be, but something might not be happening externally. For something external to happen, a transit will have to trigger something. And that's where we talk a lot about transits as astrologers, but it's because we can relate it to everybody. But not everybody experiences transits the same, of course. It depends on their cycle and on what's in their chart. So those three things you have to consider for any given thing. So here's a good analogy that my teacher here in Ireland, Pearl Finn, used to use in class. I think it works really well. And she explained it like this. So taking those three things again, you have your chart here, that's you, like a boat on an ocean. So this is you. This is all you have with you. This is everything you've gathered from previous lives in that sense. In the Vedic Indian chart, it's seen as very much past life karmas. And so you've gathered all of those for this life and you've set out on, sailing. This is you in this life. The transits are like the winds blowing you here and there, assisting you or hindering you in where you want to go. Because what's really more important than any of those things, transits in particular, are these planetary cycles I'm about to show you again. So the planetary cycles are like the ocean. And at the end of the day, the ocean is going to have its way with you. Wherever the current is going, you're going to end up going that way. Where sometimes, of course, we might feel like we're set adrift. Sometimes we might feel more directed, but the ocean is taking us somewhere. And the transits, the winds, are either helping or hindering. So when we take all three into account, what's in your chart, what cycle is there at the moment, because you're going to be taken there, and are the transits currently helping that or making it a bit more challenging, like you have to push against it? So in the end of the day, the cycles are more important than transits. That's the point here. So 3 phases of these cycles. Another way to break these down is, because like I said, Venus is 20 years long. So that's too long to say anything very definitive about a person's life over that length of time. So we can start slicing it up a bit. So the first thing you can do is divide it into 3/3. 9 planets means 3 phases. So taking the 9 planets and a cycle for each, you can break them down to the 3. And it's broken down differently depending on whether the planets you're currently experiencing are cruel or kind. The cruel planets, it's a rough translation, are Rahu and Ketu, the lunar nodes, North Node and South Node, Rahu, Ketu. Saturn, Mars, and the Sun. Sun is a lesser cruel planet, but it's cruel. And, cruel isn't necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes it's, you need to be cruel to be kind, as they say. But they challenge us. These planets will challenge us. And you might say that actually they challenge us and we do better in these cycles, whereas the kind planets, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, and Moon, make our life quite easy, and we might not actually do very much. It depends on the chart, of course, but generally the kinder planets will, help us out an awful lot, and we might get very comfortable in that too. So we need a mixture of both, of course, in our life. We need someone kind of pushing us forward, like lighting something under our, pardon my French, was going to say something rude then, but we also need a bit of comfort. So we have a mixture of both of these. So I hope you know at this point what major cycle you're in, at least. If you don't, if you're watching this playback, you can pause and go find it. If you have it there in front of you, make sure you know which one, because this will dictate how it's broken down initially, whether you're in a Rahu, Ketu, Saturn, Mars, Sun cycle, the cruel planets, or Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Moon, the kind. So if you're in one of these cruel ones, the first third or the first 3 subcycles, we'll break it down in a while, you'll see it very clearly in a while, but the first 3 subcycles will show the strengths of that, whether it's Rahu, Ketu, or any of these. It will bring out the strengths and or weaknesses of each of them in the beginning. And I'm saying and or because you can have strength in some areas of your chart and then weaknesses in other divisional charts or other areas of your life. So again, I think everything is good for something. And so a planet will always find strength somewhere, but the strengths and or weaknesses will come out in the beginning, first 3 subcycles. The next 3 subcycles, or next third, will show what it rules, the planet rules, and where it is placed. So it'll get more very specific about what that thing is and where it is in your chart, what it's impacting. And then the last 3 subcycles, or third, will show the aspects, the influences on other areas, as well as other areas onto it. So other planets influencing it as well. So it's a bit altered with the kind planets. And let's work our way around this way. So if you go from strengths to what it rules to where it's influencing, you come around up here, it finishes with the same one for the kind as well. So the influences or aspects are the last third. And then therefore it's just the other two that swap places. So for the kind, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Moon, the first third will show what it rules and where it's placed. So where is Jupiter placed in your chart? For example, if somebody has Jupiter in the 7th sign of the chart, which represents relationship, and they enter a Jupiter cycle, right away, there's a possibility of relationship because it represents 7th sign. Jupiter in 7th sign represents expansion in that area. So there's highly likelihood of somebody going into a Jupiter cycle, major cycle, experiencing relationship, because during that time, a transit is going to trigger it at some point, likely. The second third will show the strengths of Jupiter in the chart, whether it's strong or weak, and different areas it's strong or weak in different charts. And then finally, again, the same as with the cruel, the influences it gives and influences on it as well. So that's just roughly how we'd first break it down into 3 phases. So I'll be breaking this down more, so don't worry about that if you know this already. So now there are 9 planets and 27 lunar mansions. And again, so that's 3 9s is 27. So the 9 planets are broken down into 3 cycles. And I just want to bring this up a bit clearer for you. So we'll start from the top. So again, I hope you have your chart or you have your timelines. And all I need you to figure out for this is, where is your moon? All you need to figure out right now is, where is your moon? So there are 27 lunar signs all the way down. And we start at 0 degrees Aries and we make our way all the way down to the end of Pisces, 30 degrees Pisces. And each lunar sign divides zodiac into 13 degrees, 20 minutes. So we go through, and each lunar sign corresponds to a planet. And it starts with this K2 again, as I gave in the previous slide. So K2 starts at Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. That's 9. It repeats second level. K2, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. And it repeats a third time. K2, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. So basically, these are 3 cycles of the 9 planets. So they just repeat 3 times. Now, where your moon is important, because that's where you began, because this is the natural beginning, at 0 degrees Aries. But your moon might be, for example, between 10 degrees and 23 degrees Virgo. And so that will be the moon that begins it. And so that will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Start again, moon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And again, moon for the last time, and go through again. So if you could work out for now, just to know, where is your moon in the lunar sign and what planet corresponds to that, and then sketch out very quickly. If you need to pause this, if you're watching back, or if you could very quickly sketch even the first cycle, and then you'll just repeat where you began and write all 9 down. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, we can follow up after. So a bit more about the cycles, and particularly these lunar mansions and what they represent. And a slide here, I've just put up the lords or the deities that are associated with each lunar mansion, because the lunar mansions are more the realm of the gods. They are beyond the zodiac. So it's zodiac signs, solar signs are ruled by the planets, whereas the fixed lunar mansions, the stars beyond the zodiac, as it were, are ruled by gods. And these are all the gods here. I've given a very brief translation for each one. This is my interpretation of each one. Not really my interpretation, more so my translation, I suppose. So I'm just using words that can combine the god and the meaning of the lunar sign, just to give you a kind of brief sense of what each sign is about. Now, if you want to go ahead and put all your planets in, you can do that, but please at least have your moon. Know where your moon is. And again, I can go back to the previous slide for a minute, but figure out where your moon is and then which one it corresponds to. And that will say a lot about who you are. So I'll give you a moment to do that, actually. I'll go back to the first slide, and I'll just give you a moment just to make sure that you know exactly where your moon is and what the planet that it associates with, and then the following 9 or the following 8. So you have the first planet and 9 in the sequence. So just quickly jot them down.
Okay.
Okay. So again, if you know where that is now, what sign that is, the lunar mansion, I mean, then you can correlate that with each of these. So Ashvini is the first one. I call it the swift one. Bharani, the productive one. Kritika, the sharp one. Rohini, the comfortable one. Mrigashirsha, the curious one. Ardra, the purposeful one. Purnavasu, the generous one. Pushya, the nourishing one. Ashlesha, the regenerative one. Magha, the powerful one. And that completes, Ashlesha completes the first 9. And then we start the next cycle with Magha, powerful one. And this starts 0 degrees Leo. So this starts 0 degrees Aries, Ashvini, and Magha, which is associated with Ketu, again starts 0 degrees of Leo. So Magha, the powerful one. Purva Falguni, the sexy one. Uttara Falguni, the committed one. Hasta, the handy one. Chitra, the brilliant one. Swati, the independent one. Vishaka, the decisive one. Anuradha, the devoted one. And Jeshta, the secretive one. That's completed another cycle of 9. And now we're starting again with Ketu's Mula, which starts at 0 degrees Sagittarius. It's the penetrating one. Purvashada, the invincible one. Uttarashada, the responsible one. Shravana, the traditional one. Dhanishta, the practical one. Shatbisha, the eccentric one. Purvabhadrapada, the visionary one. Uttarabhadrapada, the virtuous one. And finally, Revati, to finish the zodiac, the faithful one. So I'm going to move on and just show you how you would look at that in a chart very simply. You could see it here in this format, even though there are many formats you can get online. You'll see it under Nakshatra, which is the lunar sign, basically the lunar mansion I'm referring to here. And in this case, I just drew up this chart for yesterday. This is yesterday. I just chose a random chart to, using this as an example. And the moon was in Uttara Bhadrapada. So it's here, it's in Pisces. Another way you could look at it here is you could see, well, actually the moon is here, Uttara Bhadrapada. And another way you can see it here is the cycles are printed out here shorthand, the overall major cycle, and it started with Saturn, which is associated with Uttara Bhadrapada. So again, I'll go back. Uttara Bhadrapada, 3 to 16 degrees Pisces. If you have the moon there, then it has to start with Saturn. So Saturn started this cycle in this person's life based on this person's moon. Again, this is hypothetical, obviously, because this is a chart I drew up for yesterday, but I can use it. So in this person's chart, the moon triggers Saturn from the beginning of their life. And for the first 14 years or so of their life, the moon will be active. And it will activate the moon and all it represents in their chart in the 5th sign and what that rules. And so I'm not going to go into great detail about that for this particular chart. But of course, that would have a big impact on them because the start, as I mentioned, has a big impact on us forevermore. How we began, what cycle we began within. And so let's look at each one then and just go through one by one in a general sense, what each one can show, and then we'll look at more specifically. So the first cycle naturally of the zodiac is Aries, and this sign Ashvini, the beginning. But then you have another beginning, Magha, and then Mula, as I mentioned, 0 degrees Leo, 0 degrees Sagittarius. So any of those signs, beginning of those 3 fire signs, you'd have Ketu. So you would have started in a Ketu period if you have the moon in any of these 3 lunar signs. So, and it's 7 years long, and it's cruel. And so I'll give you the positive and negative of all these cycles, and so you get a sense of them. The south node of the moon on the positive is spirituality. On the negative, it's recklessness and loss. And so, and it could be both, because Ketu points us back to something, you know, of our origins, even in a cosmic sense. And even when we take the fact that Mula, the lunar mansion at the beginning of Sagittarius, is where we see the galactic center. And this is where the black hole is, you know. So if you look through, they say around 3 to 4 degrees of Sagittarius, where that the ecliptic cuts through the path, the center of the Milky Way, that point is where Mula is, and this is ruled by Ketu. And Ketu in myth is seen as a beheaded being. And so it's this non-thinking, impulsive, you know, it represents this kind of void. And so it's the center around which everything expands and contracts, of course. And the black holes, of course, have all these kind of paradoxes, and spirituality always has paradoxes. And so this K2 period can be very confusing, to say the least. But again, it's very spiritualizing in another way. It represents our formless essence. So the thing about K2, though, remember, is that it's an eclipse. It's the south node of the moon. So it represents obscurity of the sun or moon. And so there's a tendency in this cycle to really confuse us, while at the same time offering deep insights and perspectives. And this is 7 years long. So if you're in a K2 period, either just begun or ending, it's important to acknowledge the kind of confusion which is leading to something more insightful, in fact, and more spiritual, if you'll only allow it. So another thing I want to point out here is that you'll see I've broken this cycle down into the second level as well. So you can see, again, each time them repeating the same over and over on each level. So K2 on first level, Venus on second level, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. It's the same level or same sequence in every level. This is just the first 2. This runs on 8 different levels to the minute. So on every minute, you're changing from K2 to Venus to Sun to Moon to Mars to Rahu to Jupiter, Saturn to Mercury. Every hour, every day. So understanding these cycles, and of even if it's just temporary, or if it's 7 years long, understanding cycles of confusion. And I've often heard of clients say that this confusion led to a great sense of ease afterwards, because after K2 comes Venus. One client actually, I remember saying that it was like free fall for a while, which is K2. It's a bit like being in free fall. You don't know really what's happening. It's a node of the moon. It's an eclipse. It's a shadow. It's not a planet. And then that soft landing, that is Venus. So for most people, Venus cycle, again, whether it's hours, days, months, years, is a soft landing. And if you started in the K2 cycle, then Venus would have come next, of course. But if you have your moon in Bharani, Purva Falguni, or Purvashada, then you began in Venus. And this is a kind cycle. So after the cruel K2, you have kindness. And this lasts for 20 years. It's the longest cycle, in fact. And again, repeating, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, K2. It just goes in the same sequence over and over. So you might just track where you here if you're in there. And it usually is quite an enjoyable period. Love and affection, appreciation on the positive. On the negative, there could be a lot of laziness. I can attest to that because I was born with Venus. I have my moon in Purva Falguni. So my first few years of life, Venus is very prominent in my chart anyway, in my first sign. So I was quite and it still has an impact on me. I'm a bit lazy, I'll be honest. I mean, it suits me in a way because I'm quite a driven person as well. So the laziness, I think, balances me out a bit. But it is a negative trait of Venus, because Venus in my chart is in a sign it doesn't really like to be in. But then I still have the good sides of Venus. I mean, I remember, in my early childhood being very happy. When I was a baby, they called me Smiler. Like my parents tell me that I just didn't cry ever, which was unusual, like ever. And I'm not exaggerating. So they used to call me Smiler because I just used to lie in my cot smiling because I was a Venus baby. So this was my beginning. And of course, it went south from there, but I'll talk about my son if you want, but that's a different story. So, but it's good to understand each cycle that we experience in our life and the strengths that we have in our chart. And sometimes things that don't seem strong are actually strong. So that's Venus. The next cycle then after Venus is another cruel one, and it's the sun. And the sun is just seen as it's not a first-rate malefic or cruel planet, but it is cruel. And you know that if you stay too long out in the sun, of course. But we all need a bit of sun. We all need a bit of sun for, to live, So it's like, it's not in a sense cruel in that way. And again, a bit of cruelty is a good thing. We need to be driven in life. So now this would depend, of course, on the position of the sun in your chart. Is it in a strong position? Because that would lead to confidence and leadership skills. And a sense of self-esteem. If it's weak, then it won't. It would lead to a lack of self-esteem, and you have to work harder at it. And so it can also show an egotism. That's a bit of a problem with a weak sun even. If the sun is very strong or very weak, it's an extreme sense of self or lack of sense of self, which is a big ego either way. And that's a problem with the sun, of course. A more balanced expression would be ideal, especially from a spiritual point of view. But again, everything is good for something. So if you have the moon in Kritika, Uttara Falguni, or Uttarashada, you started with the sun. Or if you had the moon in either of the other previous ones, then this would have been your third cycle. Again, it's in the third in this sequence. So sun, moon, Mars, you see the same sequence repeating again and again. So back to kind. After the moon or after the sun comes the moon. This is 10 years altogether. The sun was, 6 years for the sun. Moon is 10 years long. If you have the moon in Rohini, Hasta, or Shravana, then you would have started in a moon cycle. Again, a kind cycle. Again, depending on where the moon is in your chart, is it strong? If it is, then it's an emotional connection, especially remember that first year of life, the natural first year of life is a moon year anyway. And if you started in a moon year, so obviously if you have the moon strong position, that's a great start. Good emotional connections with people because of that emotional bonding with your caregiver, or not, and there could be challenges there if there are malefic aspects, if there are some blocks to that. Community, family, and all these things are moon related. So it's all about mother and mothering, nurturing, and your emotional well-being. So it's a really important cycle. It can be a very changeable cycle as well, because the moon is very changeable. So 10 years of changeability, especially the beginning of it, because it's on 2 levels, moon for 10 months. The person might just be feeling lots of different ways all the time, and they might not make any definitive decisions. But then when they enter the subcycle of Mars after 10 months, then they might be able to take more actions because Mars drives them, and Mars always follows the moon. So Mars is the next cycle. And we come into a cruel planet. And again, this is necessary because after moon, which is soft and doesn't really push us around, it goes kind of, our emotions override our sense of what we maybe should be doing. Mars is more about doing something. Mars is about action. So Mars would have been active if it's in this sequence for you, or if your moon, you would have started in the Mars cycle if your moon is in Mrigashirsha, Chitra, or Dhanishta. So again, Mars is, if it's strong, it's action orientated and it's courageous and brings strength. On the weak side, it's lack of motivation, lack of strength, timidity, or overcompensating for a lack and then being brutish, or being overly competitive. That's another sign of a weak Mars. So this is 7 years long altogether. So that's the Mars cycle. Now you'll notice something unusual here because we've so far gone from cruel to kind, to cruel, to kind, to cruel, and we're staying with cruel for the next one. So Mars and Rahu, the North Node. And you'll notice this every time you look at Rahu, it always shakes things up. It always spoils a pattern. It always creates this kind of otherness because Rahu is that. It always wants to do something different. So Rahu, the North Node of the moon, the shadow eclipse point, things get very interesting here. indeed. And again, because it's following a cruel time as well with Mars, and if you took on board that, of course, you could run with that. And this is where it kind of gets out of hand a bit, because Rahu represents the ego. It's a shadow that's cast over the sun or moon. And so it's our egoic self, our non-self in a way, a false self, I should say, in a way, because it's a shadow. So if you're in a Rahu cycle, it's a long cycle. It's 18 years long. If you were born with moon in Ardra, Swati, or Shatabisha, then you began in the stormy waters of Rahu. And as exciting as this cycle can be at times, especially if you're aware of it, because the more aware you are of this, the more you can restrain it and rein it in and channel it in more productive ways. And if you can do that, then it becomes a very insightful period in a person's life. Again, the node, just like the other node, the south node Ketu represents insights and spirituality. Rahu here, the north node, shows innovation, like moving forward and insights into that kind of forward momentum. However, on the downside, it could represent confusion and even delusion. So this is something to be mindful for. And again, if you're aware of it, you can mitigate that and really work with it, because Rahu is usually the period in a person's life where they're at their most successful. But if you ask them personally, well, how was that time in your life? Then they won't really remember that as a very, easy time. It's cruel. And it drives people, but it doesn't necessarily make for easy living, put it that way. But again, this is the time in a person's life where they're usually at their most successful. If Rahu is promising that in the chart, remember. So if it's in the chart, number 1, if the cycle is there, number 2, and then 3, a transit is triggering something, then success is very possible in someone's life. So now we go back to kind. After Rahu and the uncertainty of the eclipse again, we bring more certainty into our life with Jupiter. Jupiter is 16 years. If you were born with the moon in Purnavasu, Vishaka, or Purva Bhadrapada, then you started in Jupiter. And that is a good grounding for life with that kind of start. So Jupiter on the positive represents that kind of clarity and faith and wisdom and growth. It represents growth always. And something grows with Jupiter always, whatever that might be. For most people, it's usually family-related stuff, like growing their family, having kids. That's one of the things Jupiter represents. But it might not be children for you. It might be education. It might be work, whatever it might be, travel. On the downside of Jupiter, of course, there is a downside to Jupiter. It's the lack of faith, if it's weak in your chart, or if it's blocked in some way, a lack of clarity and direction, not knowing what to do. And so, of course, you can have a mix of these as well, because again, a planet might be very strong in some places, and in other places, you're not very clear. It's not very strong, so you're not very clear about that area. In other areas, you might be very clear. So that's Jupiter, usually very clear. And then after Jupiter, we go back to cruel planet, which is Saturn. After the expansion and growth of Jupiter, we come to restriction and focus and discipline of Saturn. And if you have the moon in Pushya, Anuradha, or Uttara Bhadrapada, like the example chart I showed you, that person who was born yesterday would start in this Saturn cycle. And that's quite a challenging start, usually, in a person's life, because Saturn is archetypally like an older, wiser being. And as a child going through a Saturn cycle, it can be quite challenging to be like that old person. So it's like that saying, having an old head on young shoulders. And it's cruel. So it'll make us work hard. It'll give us something to deal with. And if it's strong in our charts on the positive, it's, representing discipline, responsibility, consistency, hard work. And if it's weak, we lack those, and we might be feeling isolated even and lonely. And we have to work on something, And again, as young people, we're generally not good at the Saturn thing until we get older. And we realize that we have to focus. As a young person, we're generally wanting to do too much and move ahead too soon. And Saturn is slowing us down because it's the slowest moving planet we can see. So it gets us to really focus. And that's great for discipline and hard work and all of that, and achieving something and working for work's sake. But it doesn't bring the rewards very quickly because it's so slow. So it can be quite slow and frustrating if you're in a Saturn cycle. But after Saturn, then it switches again to a kind planet, Mercury. And this is quite a big shift because you're going from the slowest moving planet, Saturn, to the fastest moving planet, Mercury. If you were born with a Mercury cycle, it means you had the moon in Ashlesha, Jeshta, or Revati, the last signs of those water signs before the zodiac begins in the fire signs again. And it's quite an exciting start, really, if you're starting with that. But even when I see people starting, no matter the age, into a Mercury cycle, after the cycle of Saturn, they're like a child again. You know, you kind of just notice this kind of spring in their step and this childlike curiosity about life again. So Mercury's all like our inner child and very much about working things out and being curious about life again. So on the positive side, of course, it represents skills, rational thinking, and discrimination, you know, knowing truth from falsehood. But on the negative, it obviously can show a lack of clarity, mental clarity, and obscurity and daydreaming if it's on a weaker level. But it's very much about the intellect, Mercury. So those are the 9 cycles in general. And that's, of course, very general because it's very specific to your chart and what it rules in your chart, what it's doing in your chart, and so on. So I'm going to briefly now go through some things that I would look at as an astrologer in a chart and how I would work out what this planet is going to do for this person, as well as the things I mentioned. So some of them I've already gone through, and I'll just give you a few more without going to them in any detail because, again, it's not under the scope of this. So the first one, again, the stage of life I mentioned. Where is the person? How old they are they? Planets, their intrinsic nature. I mentioned a little bit about them now already. So you get a bit of a sense of each planet and what it represents. And then its strength. And that's a calculation in the chart. You might not be able to work that out. That's more of an astrologer's job, I guess. And again, sometimes it's strong in some areas and sometimes it's weak in other areas. And everything is good for something. That's how I like to think of it. What houses it rules, the areas of your chart it rules, its placement, any combinations or what we call yogas in Indian astrology, other planets it's combining with. By the way, one thing I meant to mention as I was going through this, any cycle that you're in, noticing that you've figured out hopefully where you are. So for example, if you're in a Mercury-Mars cycle, it means like it's like a conjunction of Mercury and Mars in your chart. So that's something just to be aware of. You know, being in a Mercury-Mars cycle means it's like having a Mars-Mercury conjunction in your chart and all that entails. So that's the major and sublords combined. Then the lunar mansion and its associated planet. I talked a bit about that. But another thing you could do as well, and we'll go through this in a while, is look at what cycle you're in. What is the planet you're in? And what lunar mansion is it in? And what planet is associated with that lunar mansion? I'll give you the list again. And that planet is also very active in your chart. So we'll look at that in a while. So then we look at divisions. And again, I've given you 3 major portions, just very briefly. And then the phases based on whether they're cruel or kind. Again, 3 portions. Remember the 3 portions here were like the first level, second level, third level, sun, moon, ascendant. Then the phases, was it cruel or kind? And what phases were activated at different times. Aspects I can't cover here because it's a lengthy subject, but basically all planets have aspects. We all have desires and planets are the same. When you have a planet anywhere in your chart, all planets look at the opposite sign and have a desire for that thing. But certain planets have certain special aspects as well. Outcomes as well are important, are called Argala, and basically things are kind of locked in place based on these positions. And again, this is too much to go into in this seminar, but this is an astrologer's job to define all these things, what the planet has an influence on and what results are being locked down. The essence of the cycle, this is an easy one you could do for yourself. So you literally just count from your major lord to the sublord and the same again. This is possible for some of you perhaps. So if you're in a Mercury-Venus cycle, for example, you look at Mercury in your chart and then you count from Mercury to Venus if you're in a Venus subcycle, and you count the same amount of signs again, and wherever you land, that kind of gives you the essence of the cycle as well. 9 star cycles. I'm going to show you that now. Then there are special planetary significations based on ranking by degree, and these are special, what they call characarikas. So the most important that's looked at here is the planet that has the highest degree in your chart. And that's easy to look over your chart and see what planet has the highest degree. And it's called the Atmakaraka, and it'd be written, abbreviated as AK. Now, that planet is a very special planet in your chart, and it has a very special significance for your soul. And when you go through a cycle of that planet, it's a really important time in your life. And it might have to steer you in another direction that you haven't been going, because if it's on a soul level, then, you know, sometimes our minds and our bodies might not be willing to go there. And so remember, it's the planet with the highest degree in your chart, regardless of the sign. It doesn't matter, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, wherever it is, whatever planet has the highest degree, and there are 30 degrees in a sign. So if a planet's at 28 degrees, it's most likely the highest. And on the chart, it'll be written as AK. That planet and its cycle on any level, first, second, third, whatever level, is important to look to. Next thing you look at divisional charts. Again, we can't go through that here, but you're looking at different areas of your chart, of your life, and different divisional charts. Transits, of course, this is not the subject of this, but we use transits along with this Ashtavarga, which is a point system to see how strong transits are for each individual. Again, this is all the work of an astrologer, so it's not something necessarily you'd be doing, somebody who would read your chart. Another thing to note, though, is a juncture between cycles, and as these require more care, much like joints in the body. So, for example, when, for example, let's go back one. Saturn, Jupiter is a juncture. And so this is, and I'm going to show you this more in detail at the end, but this Jupiter phase is a finishing phase of Saturn. And it points us back to the previous phase of Jupiter. So the previous major cycle was Jupiter, and this finishing phase of Saturn is Jupiter, and it's like a joint in time. And so for those 2.5 years, this is kind of preparing the person for the next major cycle. So it's like a joint in your body. It's weaker in a joint. So it's kind of like a time where things are shifting around, and the Saturn qualities are starting to break up in Jupiter. The heaviness of Saturn, the hard work and discipline and all those kind of things you have to be responsible for, it's seen as quite heavy. All of that starts to break up and to give way in a Jupiter subcycle, and then make way for Mercury, which is quite excitable. And so a kind of more agitated, desireful quality is being awoken in you when Mercury starts kicking in. So you're moving from a more stagnant phase to a more excitable, movable phase from Saturn to Mercury. And it's that last phase there, Jupiter, that's preparing you. So every time you go through a last cycle, an ending of a major cycle, before you start a new cycle, that is one to watch always, always, always. Okay, so those are the things that you base the thing on. So, for example, this person here, hypothetical person, is born with moon in Uttara Bhadrapada. So the Saturn cycle began, and then they moved into Mercury at 14. That would have been a big shift for them. And then that's a 17-year cycle. And so they went to K2 until the age of 31, and then Venus, and then so on and so on. So I hope you can work that out for yourself. And this is, again, this hypothetical person. And again, this is something you can easily find if you don't have it already. You basically can see right from the beginning, this person would have been born in a Saturn and Mercury on the second level. These two planets would have a big say in their life forevermore because of that. You know, it says minus here because it was just the tail end of the Saturn Mercury, and then Saturn K2 started when they were just over 1 year of age, 1.3. So you read it down that way. The major cycle is always the first one on the outside, and it changes for after many years. And then the subcycle on the second level changes every few years or so, 1 to 2, 3 years at most. Then you see here that I've broken it down to 3 levels, but I can't fill all of these, you know, because this actually only occurred over 10 years, 11 years. This would fill up few slides, but this is how you can look at it more, hone it in more. And if you can look at your own from the beginning or from now, you can see 3 levels active. And I mentioned these 3 levels. The first level shows more on a soul level, the second on a more emotional level, and the third more an instinctual, kind of gut-based, sort of reactionary, decisive level. So the decisions are basically made on this level based on what you're feeling and what's happening in your environment, the first level. So I hope you can work that out for yourself. And if not, you can go away and maybe study and find your timelines and study them. Unfortunately, most online resources don't give you 3 levels like this. You'd have to buy a software. But most would give you at least 1 or if not 2 levels like this. Now, just want to point out to you as well that you can see here they started Saturn, Mercury, or they would have if they were born yesterday. I calculated this for yesterday, Saturn, Mercury. And that would have ran until the 9th of September next year, Saturn, Ketu. And you go all along and you see Mercury, Ketu, and you go all the way down here. And then you see around the age of 120, they start repeating again, because that's in total what the whole cycle means. So Saturn, Mercury will kick in again around that, and they start repeating Saturn, Ketu, and so on, and it will go through this sequence again. So it's all in total 120 years, and that again was the ideal lifespan in the Vedic era. Okay, so now we go to the 9 stars. These are the 9, breaking them each one down into different phases as a phase in and of itself. As I mentioned, there are 9 cycles repeated 3 times and on every level, but just taking the first level, this is what they're called, but I've just given my very brief one-word translations. This is my translation, and you know, there are other translations that are given, but some words can be like, for example, the 7th one, sometimes they use the word death, which is like saying the tarot card, the death card, is literally death, and it's obviously not. So there's no need to put death there. All it means is change. So let me just check if people are seeing the screen. So here we have the Navatara, the 9 stars. That's the literal translation. Nava is 9, Tara is stars. And it breaks down each one. Let me resume recording and see what happens. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, and hopefully you'll see a list of the 9 stars. If you can let me know. Okay, so yes. Give it a minute. Just, yeah, please give it a minute because it will come up. I think it might be your connection too. That's a bit slow. So just please, yeah, just give it a minute. Great, thank you. So here are the 9 stars, or Navatara. And these again, just Sanskrit words I'm afraid I have to give you, but this is just in case you come across them and you don't know what they mean. I'll give you their meanings. So, and someone asked me there as well about, well, what does it mean for us? This is another way to break it down. You can see how each one have a particular kind of theme related. So the first of every cycle, the one you started with, so depending on where your moon is again, whether you started in a moon, sun, Venus, Mars, whatever it is, that's the start. And that's the first cycle. So then if it was Venus, it would be the sun next, and moon, and so on. So whatever your start is, it's the first one, it's the start. And every time on any level you go through that planet, it will always restart things in your life. Now, of course, that could be challenging or it could be rewarding, depending, because it depends on your start. It depends on how you started in life, right? So that is the start, and it's called Jamna. So start, the first one. And then the second one is about growing something. Sampat. Third is a pause. So you start something, you grow it, and then you pause for a while. And that's probably a nice way of saying that you're a bit challenged with it, because you've now grown, you've started and grown something and you're challenged with it. And that's vipat. After that challenge, then you secure something, kshema. And then after that, you work at it. And that can challenge you too, the fifth one. The first sometimes, the third, yes, sometimes also. Fifth, these can challenge you. So because you have to work at something. So the fifth is pratyari. The sixth is about attaining something, sadhaka. You might know of a sadhu or a sadhaka. These are people who attain skills. So I'm going to go through this as well, and I'll answer all questions at the end. Just I want to get through and any questions you can type these in absolutely now as well, yeah, but maybe hold them to the end because I can get very distracted. So I'm that kind of personality. I'm looking to please everybody. So the sixth cycle, sadhaka, is about attaining something. So you work at something then, and then you attain it. So you're skilled in it. Another word here is siddhi. And then the seventh one can challenge you again because it's challenging you to change. Because by this, now I'm hoping that you're going down, looking through your own list of cycles and started at the first one, major cycle to start with, second cycle, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. So by the seventh one, we are challenged again to change, because once we've attained a skill, we are like siddhi, a sadhaka, we're then challenged to change it up a bit. So that's the seventh cycle, vada. And then on the eighth cycle, we befriend something. We make peace with something, mitra. And then ninth cycle is ati mitra, which is even better. It's even a deeper connection with something. And these 9 go in order, again, every day, every week, every month, every year. We change cycles and we go from one to the other. But if on a major level, you're going through many years, then this is something to pay attention to. Again, know your first cycle, track it from there. Where you're right now on the cycle. If you're in any way like, if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s upwards, like you're going to be talking about like at least up here in the middle section, if not further, right? It depends where you started from, because some cycles are a bit shorter than others. So I'm going to keep going on. And again, I'll answer questions at the end. Please let me know if the slides are still showing. And I just want to show you again and remind you of these cycles. And again, hopefully you have a good sense of where you're at right now in terms of those 9 cycles. These are the natural 9 cycles and 3 cycles of each 9. 1, 2, 3. But where you're at depends on where you started. So if you started with here, for example, Mars, then it would be from Mars to 9 to the next Mars, right? And that would be, so Mars would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And again, refer back to that table. So again, if you don't know exactly what it is, we can look at that after, but contact me again by email if you cannot do it at this point. And let's just go through them again one by one. So the first one, again, first cycle in your life, Jamna, starting point. The first cycle is the one you were born with. It shows the overall beginnings and an important planet in your life experience, impacting how you experience life in a profound way. Every time you enter this planetary cycle, as a subcycle, it will show a new beginning, a reset in your life. Similar themes will be apparent, which can either be easy or challenging depending on your beginning in life. So that's quite obvious. So it's a reset every time you go through that planet. So again, where your moon is and that cycle that kicked off will restart every time you start that cycle again. The second one then is about growing something. Represents a period of growth. As one translation of the word sampat means to acquire. It generally represents a period of wealth and prosperity, some form of blessing. Now, it doesn't mean monetary wealth always, of course, but it is some form of blessing generally. And this would have to be married with the other significations of the planet in your chart, because although overall this would be a blessing, the planet itself might be challenging for you depending on what the planet is and where it is in your chart. So you have to marry all of these things together. The third vipat is a pausing phase where it requires patience in achieving an objective. You've started something, you've started to grow it, and it kind of like anything you start, like a business, there's a pausing phase, you know, and so it can show obstacles we have to overcome. But these same obstacles build strength and endurance as we learn patience and forbearance. And it's just said here, the obstacle is the way. So that's the third cycle. Keep an eye on your own cycles here again. So the fourth one, Kshema, is securing. The fourth cycle is a more relaxed affair after the challenges of the previous third cycle. The word Kshema means safety, tranquility, peace, rest, security, offering a sense of ease and comfort in some form or other. The fifth cycle will challenge again and challenge us to work. It challenges us with what seems to be a well-matched opponent. That's what the word Planetary means. This teaches us to work harder as and when we are challenged to up our game. So that just means we have to, you know, if we meet our opponent or we meet someone who's we're well matched with, it just challenges us to do better. And that's a good thing. The next one then is sadhaka, attaining something. The sixth cycle demonstrates the challenges of the previous cycle were not in vain. After working hard on something, we become an expert. Sadhaka means skill or accomplishment, and a sadhaka is someone who attains a siddhi or power. Then the next cycle, vada, is a changing cycle. And the seventh cycle challenges us again to change direction once we have attained a skill. It's like you have perfected a skill in something and you have to change course. You know, you don't do this consciously, of course, and most of this is not conscious. But we are usually up for the task at this stage, the challenge at this stage, because we've perfected a skill. So we're usually up for it. Vada means a deadly weapon, and the word Vajrada, you might know the word Vajra is the death by thunderbolt. It's what Indra uses as a weapon, the Vajra. He's the chief of the gods whose tasks of overcoming something in our lives, changing something into something else. So it challenges us to overcome something. The eighth cycle then is Mitra and befriending cycle. So the eighth cycle brings us into contact with friends and supporters to help us on our path. Mitra means literally friend, and this brings back a sense of support after the previous period of challenge and change. This is a time of contractual agreements, as Mitra is the god of friendship and agreements. And then we have another very beneficial time after the eighth, the ninth, the last one, finishing up this whole 9 cycles. Ati Mitra is even a deeper connection, a friendship, and even love bond. The 9th and final cycle, before we begin again, shows an even greater sense of friendship and agreement. So it could be a divine bond, it could be a deeper love and connection to someone or something. So those are the 9 cycles. Again, they happen on many levels, but most importantly, to keep an eye on them on a major level, because we're going through them intensely when we go through them for many years. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns to finish. Some patterns that we have in our life reflected in these cycles. So the first pattern is, and this is something you might want to try later on, is you can break them down again into 3 groups. And I've already given you the first sequence of 9, from 1 to 9 here. But of course, there are 27 of them, so you can break them down into 3 groups of 9. So again, know what the first cycle is, and then you'll be able to work all of them out based on that table, which I'll give you again. So you put wherever your moon is in this first grouping, in the first column, and then you just keep writing them down in order. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, all the way down to 9th, and then 10th, all the way down, and all the way down. And you'll fill in all of those blanks if you wish in your own time, using a template like this. Basically just writing down 3 groups of 9. And you do that from this list. So again, depending on where you began, where your moon was, depending on what sign it was in, we'll start the whole sequence off. And when you've written down all 27, 3 9s, then you'll know then which planets, kick off those cycles. So the last thing I want to share with you today is the golden ratio, which is a fascinating subject in and of itself, but it actually shows up in these cycles, believe it or not. And this is taken from a presentation that Raphael Gilbrand, he's a German astrologer, he gave to the British Association. BAVA is the British Association of Vedic Astrology.org. Now, the only thing is that you have to be a member to actually download this talk on decoding Vimshottari Dasha. This is the Dasha I've been talking about today. But I can just give you a brief synopsis here. And so he did a really nice job of illustrating mathematically how the golden ratio is seen in the dashas, which is amazing when you think about it. And this principle of self-resemblance, the whole is resembled in the part. It's like really what astrology is based on. So it kind of like that sense of fractals. So here obviously is a nice representation of the golden ratio, and I'll explain what that is now. So it's you might be familiar with the Fibonacci sequence. Fibonacci was an Italian mathematician. I think it was back in the 13th century or something. So he came up with this sequence of numbers based on this experiment he was doing with breeding rabbits, which is kind of bizarre, but he was getting pairs of rabbits breeding, and he left them for a year and he looked at the numbers, and he came up with this this sequence, and he wrote a book about it. And so each number is added to the previous one to get the next one. So obviously 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, and so on. And you just keep adding them up and up and up and up, and it goes up and up. Now, the golden ratio, the number is exactly this, 1.618033, so on. This is the Fibonacci sequence, and this roughly correlates and eventually exactly correlates with this. So I've just worked it out here. I put in some asterisks here just to show you at what points it comes into alignment. It doesn't start off that way. As it builds up, it gets into alignment. So by this stage 21, it has reached 1.61. By this stage 89, it's 1.618. And then by this stage, it's exactly 1.68033. So it's getting closer and closer the further you go up. And it's kind of like a representation of how, you know, when we move from a center and move out, this sequence starts getting more and more defined and more perfected. And that's in nature, it's in everything. And it's in us, not just our physical bodies, this sequence. Like if you use the ratio of arm to leg ratio to trunk to everything, the sequence is everywhere in nature. Like I said, it's in our bodies, and it's in these cycles. So I'll just show you how this sequence looks in this sense here, in the 5-pointed star, which is a representation of Venus, by the way. If you know how Venus tracks its path in the heavens, it makes this 5-pointed star with its retrograde cycles. So you divide A with B, and you get the golden ratio. You divide B by C, and you get the golden ratio. And then you divide C by D, and you get the golden ratio. So you keep dividing things, and you keep coming up with this golden ratio. And the same applies to these cycles. These are all the cycles together in one screen. And again, I hope that you've been able to work these out for yourself. But I might be able to show you a few other things about them that are interesting as well. So I can't go into it now because it's too much to show. I mean, there's many, many things. Again, I would refer you to that presentation on the British Association website by Raphael Gilbrand. And it's a good one to watch if you're interested in that. But basically, if you divide up the years and length different ways, and you start dividing them down, and you keep coming up with this golden ratio, basically. And what it's stating is that just as our body is a representation of the golden ratio, we're perfectly formed in that way, so our life is perfectly formed in that way. Our life is an ever-expanding ratio of numbers, in other words. Our life is ever-expanding in a perfect, absolute perfect way. And so every feeling, every thought, every action we take, every experience we have is perfect. And when I say that, I don't mean that it feels great all the time, but it is perfect. It is literally in alignment with the universe, with this golden mean or golden ratio. And so it's like a natural thing. It's in nature, it's in us. So all of our life experience, all these cycles are a natural experience we have in our life. So a few other things just to finish up is that you'll notice I've just put 2 levels here to fill the page. And I started again with K2, K2. You'll notice that there's a few other patterns that you'll start seeing. And that is the second level here of K2 is Venus. Because it has to be. Because whether you break it down to 2 levels or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, K2 Venus is always the sequence. K2 Venus Sun as a given. But it means that the second level of K2 cycle is Venus, and it points you forward to what you'll experience in many years from then in the next major shift into Venus. And then look forward into Venus, for example, and notice the last subcycle of Venus is K2. And K2 points you back to where you've come from in the last major cycle of K2. And that repeats through all the cycles. Sun, 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 Moon. Moon is the next one. End of Moon is Sun, Moon, Sun. Mars, 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 Rahu. So on. It just repeats all through the cycles, and not just on these 2 levels, on 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 levels. So that it's a good way of how this golden ratio or this golden mean is mapped out in our life. It's almost like this, just imagine again this spiral. It's like it's swinging around, coming back and going out, and coming back and going out, and coming back and going out. So it's kind of our lives are constantly showing us back to where we come from and showing us where we're going, and showing us back and showing us where we're going. And it's this perfect formation really in our chart. And that's why astrology is very much about cycles and showing these patterns repeating in our life, always pointing us back to the past and pointing us forward into the future. So I just wanted to give you that sense of the cycles and how they operate. And again, if you don't have your cycles, an option is either to go to this astro-seek.com, check up the sidereal astrology chart calculator and calculate your own chart. Or again, contact me if you don't have it already, info@timelineastrology.com, and I'll be happy to calculate yours for you as well. And then just to finish up, I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for attending and for your patience throughout this presentation. I hope you got something out of it. And of course, a bit of a plug now and a bit of a, an appeal in a way, because I'm going more and more towards working for patrons who support me. And this is the way of the future, I really think, and especially for astrologers to be able to make a living. So if you haven't already, I know a lot of you on the call already have become a patron, but if you could, sign up as a patron on patreon.com and support my work for as little as $5. So it's only $5 a month. You can go up higher tiers and get more. $5 a month will get you daily posts. I write daily in-depth posts, which you can get into your inbox. And I write monthly in-depth reports. And I have this, what I call the Scorpio Video Club, which is a bit corny, I know, but it's basically like more kind of secret, I guess I'm calling it Scorpio, so it's more secretive sort of techniques of Indian astrology, and I'm sharing those in short video formats with patrons as well. So I offer a lot, I think I do, but and for only $5 a month. The $10 a month is more like if you want then to email me every month with questions. And then there's a $50 one if you want to email every week with questions. And then there's an $80 a month, the highest one, where I mentor you if you're an astrologer and you want to train with me. So I have a few people I'm mentoring at the moment. So those are the 4 levels. But again, you can just start on the $5 level to support my work. And so that's it. I thank you for listening. This has been me talking to the screen. So I've enjoyed it. I don't know if you have, but I really hope you got something out of it. So again, thank you.